Mary, the hyped up Hufflepuff, and today I want to discuss my top 19 books from 2019. Usually I would start off each of my videos discussing what I'm reading at the moment and what I'm drinking, but at the moment I'm not reading anything. I was in a bit of a reading slump all throughout November because it was just a really bad month, honestly, and right now I want to focus on this and getting as many videos out as I can, and then probably the last couple of weeks of December I'm going to just do nothing but read for a little while. And I'm also not drinking anything at the moment, so I fail. This isn't going to be in any particular order necessarily, though I am going to start off at the beginning of the video going over the books that I don't have a physical copy of because I'll have to add a picture in, and it'll just make things a little bit easier, I guess. While these aren't going to be in any particular order, I am going to continue to kind of number these off as I go so that it's a little easier to keep track of how many I have mentioned, because I specifically wanted to do 19 books of 2019, and then next year I'm going to do 20 of 2020, and it's just going to keep on going from there. So it's going to be fun when we get to 2050, so never mind the fact that I'm going to be 60 years old then. I do want to say that some of these I read at the very beginning of the year, so I don't necessarily remember the rating that I gave them right off the top of my head, but I'll do the best I can to remember, and give kind of a summary of how I feel about that book now and how it has stayed with me throughout the year. The first book is Dumplin by Julie Murphy. This book had a big impact on me, as did the movie. I think they were both pretty much equally as good, but the movie served to kind of give a visual medium to the book. I know that this isn't making sense. It helps better with representation, I think, because there have been a lot of books with plus-size characters, but then when it comes to translating them to screen, they end up being downsized. You know, so someone will be plus-sized in the book and then you translate it to screen and they're just, you know, whoop, average-sized human being, and that's considered plus-sized. I know the biggest example I can think of is the book Holes by Louis Sachar. I don't know how to pronounce his name exactly, but that was one of my favorite books growing up, and I was so excited for the movie. And when it came out, the main character, Stanley Yelnats, he's supposed to be plus-sized. He's a big boy in the books. That is a big part of the book, which is why I related to the character so much. And then they translate it to screen, and he's being played by Shia LaBeouf, who, as you know, is not a large person. And even as a child, maybe he had kind of chubby cheeks, but he was not large. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. My point is, I feel like in this case, it does kind of translate a little bit better to screen for the purpose of representation. The book itself was extremely enjoyable. I would recommend it to everyone, particularly people who are plus-sized and grew up plus-sized. It was an extremely touching book. It is about a girl who goes by the nickname of Dumplin. Her mother works in beauty pageants, basically. She won a beauty pageant when she was a teenager and decided that she was going to stay in it for the rest of her life, basically. And her daughter, Dumplin, kind of feels like she's being judged for it, and she can never really measure up to her mother. And there's a lot going on. And then Dumplin ends up deciding to join the beauty pageant to show that you don't have to be thin in order to be part of the pageant. It's kind of a matter of protest, or it starts out that way, and then she ends up genuinely enjoying it and learning more about herself and about the people around her. And I am making it sound a bit cheesy, but trust me, it's immensely enjoyable. It's also extremely moving. I cried more than once reading this book. I won't give away any spoilers, but it's just enough to move one to tears, even if you didn't grow up plus size. As far as ratings go, I'm pretty sure I gave the book a 4 or a 4.5, probably around a 4.5. It wasn't always the best written book. I'm not going to say it was the best thing that I have ever read, but it did have a large impact on me as a person, I believe. The next book I don't have a physical copy of because I checked it out from the library is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Eliot Sands. This was such a sweet book. I spent the entire time reading this book smiling almost, other than, of course, the darker moments. And I read most of it in one sitting, and by the end of it, my face, it hurt from smiling and crying, and it was just so delightful. It's been a little while since I read it. I read it at the beginning of the year, so forgive me, but from what I recall, it is about a boy on the edge of adulthood, like a teenager, and he doesn't really have any friends. Because he's kind of seen as a little bit weird, and he's honestly a little bit aggressive. He's got a bit of an anger problem, and he doesn't really express any of his feelings. And then he meets this person named Dante, and they immediately end up bonding because his name is Aristotle, and he's never met anyone else with the name of someone from the Renaissance. So they end up bonding. One of them teaches the other to swim. I can't remember which is which. I think Aristotle teaches Dante how to swim. I'm not positive. But Dante ends up teaching Ari, is what he goes by, more about himself as well, and how to open up and how to kind of let people in. And Ari kind of teaches Dante a similar lesson when it comes to his art, basically. And the two end up discovering that over time they kind of fell in love, and they end up together. No spoilers. But it takes so long to get to that point, and so much happens in between, that I feel like it isn't a huge spoiler, but it's just such a sweet book. I adored it. I thought it was so well written. I would definitely give it a 4.5 or a 5. I can't remember what the actual rating that I gave it when I read the book, but at this point, just thinking about this book still kind of makes me want to cry a little bit because it was so damn sweet. And there was so much to it. I really want to reread it again. I want a physical copy of this book, and I want to be able to sit down and take my time rereading it, because when I had it, it was a library book, and I started this one at the very end of the term that I had to get these books back, so I just had to read it like all in one sitting, if I remember correctly. But yeah. Absolutely recommend this. Absolutely one of my favorite books of 2019. The next book on this list is Blue is the Warmest Color by Julie Moreau, and this was more of a graphic novel technically, but it was as deep and as moving as any book, and I still absolutely count graphic novels as books. You can think what you want, but that is how I categorize them. This book hurt me. It hurt me on a deep level, but at the same time, I greatly enjoyed it, and I appreciate the fact that it exists, because I think it is an important book. It is basically about the trials of a woman who is unsure of her sexuality, and surviving in the 90s, I believe, is where this takes place, in a world that is still not entirely accepting of people who are from the LGBTQIA community. I'm not saying that the world is entirely accepting now, but the 90s was a very different time period for those who are not aware. And she basically ends up losing a lot of her friends once she starts to come out and really figure out who she is, and the fact that she is bisexual, basically, and is attracted to both men and women more so. And she ends up in this relationship, this very intense relationship, that basically ends up driving her to the point of insanity. And I won't say anything more than that, because there are some major spoilers in there. It is a heartbreaking book, to say the least, and I would tread carefully going in to read it, but it is also very important. Just know it's going to hurt you. It is going to make you smile. It is going to make you cry. It is going to hurt you. And you will probably like it. So yes, that is my third favorite book in 2019. The fourth book that I don't have a physical copy of is Dear Martin by Nick Stone. This book is about a teenager who is in a journalism class, if I remember correctly. All of these are from the beginning of the year, so it's just like way in the back of my mind at this point. But I believe he was in a journalism class or an English class, and he ends up deciding to do a project where he writes letters to Martin Luther King Jr. and kind of tries to live his life as he thought that Martin Luther King would live it. The thing is, though, he ends up kind of missing the point of the lessons of Martin Luther King Jr. and sort of ends up going off in a different direction. He realizes his mistake by the end of the book, but it takes him a while to get there. It's a sweet book. It's heartwarming to an extent, but it's also extremely topical. There is so much racial tension going on in these books. Well, not these books, this book in particular. A lot of people have compared it to The Hate You Give, but there isn't necessarily a huge connect, from what I remember. I believe one of his friends does end up getting shot, but it's not the central, cornerstone of the book. But it was another book that absolutely moved me, and the only problem that I had with this book, and I believe I gave it a 4 or something along those lines because of this, was the way that it was written. The writer kind of bounced between writing styles for no particular reason. I can understand if there was a particular reason, but in one hand it was just written like a regular novel, next chapter it's a screenplay, and it bounced around, and it's cool that Nick Stone wanted to do something creative, and I applaud him for it, but at the same time, I don't think it worked all that well, and it was just more distracting and took me out of the story than anything. Other than that, though, I really enjoyed it and recommend it to anyone. I know I'm not doing a great job describing it. Again, it's been a while, but it still left enough of an impact on me that I can remember the basic premise and how it made me feel, which I think is the important part. The fifth and last book that I don't have a physical copy of is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This one I didn't have a physical copy of because I read it on audiobook. Well, listened to it rather, on audiobook. I couldn't sleep one night, put it on, and listened to the whole thing before I woke up the next morning. I didn't just play it while I slept, like I just didn't sleep that night and only listened to The Bell Jar. I'm starting to notice a trend. This was a very depressing book. I think it kind of has that reputation, and Sylvia Plath in general has that reputation. But yeah, it's a very depressing book. The main character goes off to college and is kind of struggling to figure out who she is and what her point is in the world, and kind of what the point of anything is, what she wants. It's definitely a book about self-discovery. It's also kind of about her struggles with mental illness and, depression in general, and just figuring out where she fits in life. I think I ended up giving it a 4 or a 4.5, somewhere around a 4. And I would maybe tread lightly when it comes to this one as well, because there were some elements that were fairly triggering, and it can, again, be a very depressing book, more so than any of the rest of these, other than maybe blue is the warmest color. But yeah, just know going in that this book, it's depressing. It's not a happy, feel-good book, like, at all. I guess it has moments, but it's not happy, feel-good. It's interesting, it's extremely well written, it's immensely interesting. I will give it all of those things, and I loved this book but just put your crying pants on. That's all I'm saying. From this point on, I'll only be discussing physical books, which you can see I have a large pile of here. Let's start with If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler by Italo Calvino. I believe I'm getting that right. Yeah, Italo Calvino. This one is one which, I'm sorry, I can't really explain the plot of, because it's just all over the place. I believe I just described it as whimsical chaos. It is the most recent book that I read. It's definitely an experimental book, in my opinion, but one that is absolutely worth reading, and just absolutely worth the time and effort that went into it. And I commend Italo Calvino for, writing this as he did. I gave this book 5 stars and would recommend looking into it. Even if you look up a description online, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you, it's not necessarily going to be accurate, because this book is all over the place, and I adore it. The next book that I want to discuss is Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. This is another one of those books where the book and the movie are pretty much just as good. I don't really recommend one over the other. Both of them have their positives and negatives, and I enjoyed both of them just as much. I ended up giving this book 5 stars, if I remember correctly. It is about the FBI investigator who goes by the name of Will Graham, and he is the person who took down Hannibal Lecter. Now, Will Graham has to ask for Hannibal Lecter's help in pursuing a serial killer with a large red dragon tattooed on his back, who gives himself the nickname of the Tooth Fairy, I think, which honestly is kind of lame. Why not just use the red dragon? Anyway, there's so much suspense building up in this book, but it's just one of those where the steps that the investigator takes to get into the head of the serial killer is just legitimately fascinating. And this book, it had my heart racing and my mind just going all over the place. I would absolutely recommend it. I feel like I should have written this down. In the future, I'm gonna have to write out all of this. But yeah, definitely recommend Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. Took me a minute to finally get to reading it, because I tried to read Hannibal Rising in the past, and I didn't really like it, and I assumed that was what all of Thomas Harris's writing was like, but no, apparently not. This was legitimately a wonderful book, and one of my favorites of 2019. I'm picking up my phone temporarily because Ezra has been laying here being adorable this entire time, and you haven't been able to see her. She's just been laying here being sweet. Anyway, I thought that you should get in on that cute action. The 8th book that I want to discuss is The Omen by David Seltzer. This book highly influenced the book Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, I think is who wrote it. Can't remember specifically, but that is also one of my favorite books. This was a heavy influence on that, and kind of automatically makes it one of my new favorite books. Absolutely one of my favorite books of 2019. The ending was amazing. I would read it again just for the ending. I absolutely enjoyed it. It made me so uncomfortable, but in a great way. I realize that sounds completely ludicrous. I'm like, this book made me so uncomfortable. I loved it. But yeah, that's the case. I am really creeped out by weird, creepy little kids. Like, that is one of my big things. And I'm also creeped out by stuff like, I don't know, the Antichrist and stuff like that. It's just, it hits a special place inside me where I'm just like, no, maybe keep that away from me. But in this case, I absolutely loved it. would absolutely read it again. I probably will end up reading it again because the first time that I read it, I was not feeling well. And yeah, I think it deserves a reread. As it stands, I believe I gave it a 4.5, if I remember correctly, and it definitely deserves that rating. The ninth book I want to discuss is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I loved every single minute of reading this book, and will absolutely read it again. I'll probably have a reread of this book sometime next year and see if anyone wants to do a buddy read. This book was full of adventure and intrigue and romance and plots and backstabbing, and it just, it's so much more interesting than the plot itself makes it sound, because everyone always just focuses on the romance. And I'm not saying that there's anything romance, there's not, but it sells this book short to simply say that it is a romance. So the plot is basically that these two individuals are basically made contestants in this competition at a very young age, and they don't know who the other person is, only that somewhere out there they have an opponent. Like, they have one chosen opponent who has been specifically assigned to them. That's all they really know. And they don't even really necessarily know what the competition is, and they're trained in all these different sorts of ways. One of them is trained in kind of healing, and the other one is just kind of all over the place. But it's a fascinating read. Absolutely fascinating. There's magic, there's whimsy out the ass. If you like kind of a dark circus, like a night circus type setting, it's super interesting. It goes off in all sorts of directions, and this is 100% a book that I would recommend to almost everyone. And if I was doing a, from 19 to number 1 setting, this would be at the very top, I'm pretty sure. Maybe number 1. I absolutely adore it. No, I take that back. I know what would be my number 1. This would probably be my number 2, though. So yeah, if you haven't read it yet, go for it. Starts out a bit slow, and then by the end is just like, ah. So I'm sure you've noticed that a lot of these are books that I have read more recently, and there's honestly a good reason for that. Several good reasons, actually. Probably the fact that they are more recent and thus more readily available in my mind. Like, the information is I can remember how much I enjoyed them. Second of all, in October I read so many good books, particularly due to the fact that horror and thriller are, they're two of my absolute favorite genres. I enjoy most books in those two categories. I haven't found many that I just didn't like outright, though I plan on doing a bottom 19 books of the year. If I can scrounge up 19 books that I didn't like this year, it might end up being like a 5 or a 10. But yeah, that is why there are so many similarities. There's a little bit more from the beginning of the year, but if you remember correctly, I had a huge reading slump from around February to September, I believe. And before that, all of the books that I read at the beginning of the year, other than, a select few, I did not like. The beginning of the year was so bad for reading for me. It was just not good. And then the end of the year was great. Like, I have so many 5, 4.5, and 4-star books that are just from the end of the year. It's crazy. But anyway, I am going on a tangent again, and yeah, let's get back to the list. The 10th book I want to discuss is City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. I don't think this is necessarily a controversial opinion, but the fact is, before I read this book, I thought I was going to hate it, and avoided reading it for years for that very reason. And then finally I ended up borrowing it from my friend Kimberly. She will get this book back, I promise. Borrowed it from my friend Kimberly, read it all in a couple of days' time, absolutely adored it. Basically, the story is the main character, Clary, starts being able to see these people and these creatures that other people can't see, and ends up discovering that she is a shadow hunter. Her mother is attacked. I'm not going to say necessarily by what, but her mother is attacked and is up in the hospital, and she ends up having to kind of live her life as a shadow hunter and be trained by other shadow hunters, and comes to realize that all of these things that she thought were basically fairy tales for her entire life are all true. Vampires, werewolves, fae, all these things, they all exist in this universe, and it's the shadow hunter's job to basically keep the peace and to hunt those down who break the rules, basically. This is just the first book in the entire series. It's a huge series, but I highly enjoyed it. I've read the first one and the second one now. Love them both. Definitely plan on reading more of them. I didn't have the second book on this list because I feel like it'd be a little redundant to have two books from the same series on this list. It feels like it wouldn't be right to me. The 11th book that I want to discuss was another surprise. It's The Selection by Kiera Cass. And this book came through for me when I really needed it. This is what broke me out of my several month-long slump. It's light, and it's definitely a young adult book, but it is absolutely what I needed at the time and has a special place in my heart. It is about a character, okay, I'm gonna admit, I hate this name, but about a main character named America. But don't let it stop you. The book is better than the main character's name. No offense, Kiera Cass, but it's a terrible name for a main character. But, continuing on, this is set in a dystopian future where all of the people have been separated into different groups based on number, and each group is meant to adhere to a certain purpose and kind of goes down in class the higher the number. If I remember correctly, yeah. It's a very Hunger Games-esque. It's like Hunger Games meets The Bachelor, with a little bit more mixed in. It's honestly, I enjoyed every bit of it. It's one of those where it's definitely not super cerebral, but at the same time it doesn't lack depth. And it borrowed a lot from other books, but it also has its own identity. It absolutely has its own identity. And the two love interests in this book, yes, it's another love triangle. Yes, it's annoying. That is something that would absolutely have deterred me from reading this before, but I didn't mind it in this case. I want to punch them both at different times, but for the most part, they're genuinely likable characters and get a great kind of they get a satisfying conclusion if you read the entire series. But yeah, this one I would definitely recommend if you are going to the beach, if you just enjoy, young adult novels, fluffy dystopian novels. I know those two words, fluffy, dystopian, they don't mix, but it works. It works in this case. Yeah, definitely check it out. I think I gave it a 4.5. 4.5, yeah, it had to have been a 4 or 4.5, somewhere around there. It definitely was not a 5, but it was nowhere under a 4. I know that for sure. The next book I want to discuss, I have already fawned over numerous times, and I'm going to do it again. It's Night Shift by Stephen King. If you have not read anything by Stephen King, or you haven't really read that much by him, or you read one thing, you didn't really like it because it was a bad recommendation, absolutely recommend Night Shift by Stephen King because it has like 20 different short stories written by him, all of them very different in nature, touching on different things. Some of them are horror, some of them are thriller, some of them are just, drama or just very emotional, tugging at your heartstrings. Some of them combine all three. Either way, it's just such a fun read. He does so much with all of these different ideas, and a lot of them tie into the novels that he ended up writing afterward, like Salem's Lot and The Stand. But yeah, absolutely recommend it. Gave it 5 stars. Can't really summarize the plots. Still plan on making a video for it, but it's probably going to come out next October rather than sometime this year, because it's going to take a lot of time to rate and summarize each one of these short stories. That's going to be a long-ass video, and it's definitely going to require an actual script rather than just kind of ad-libbing like I'm doing now. The next book that I want to discuss is actually a manga. It is by Natsuki Takaya, called Fruits Basket, and basically this girl named... oh, good. Well, her last name is Honda. We'll go by Honda. That's easier. But Honda, she ends up living in this house with several individuals, each of them based on the Chinese zodiac, if you can see that. I thought it was an immensely interesting premise and had seen part of the actual show and figured I would give it a try. That plus the fact that this is my girlfriend's favorite manga, and then she named one of her cats Kyo after one of the main characters, had me extremely interested, and it is such a light-hearted, fun manga, but at the same time it has a lot of heart. I definitely want to go on to read the rest of the manga and watch the rest of the show, but this is one of those where I would definitely recommend it. I sadly don't get to read a lot of manga because they're a little bit expensive, if I'm honest, and this one I lucked upon it at a Goodwill. So it was like 50 cents, and I was like, hot dang, yes, I'm absolutely getting this. But yeah, definitely recommend it, especially if you're into manga and that sort of thing. Fruits Basket by Natsuki Takaya. Yes, that is the person. Look into it. The 14th book that I want to discuss is Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill, who, as you know, is the son of Stephen King and absolutely lives up to the family name. This was the second book by Joe Hill that I read by Stephen King, and it measured up to the first one. Another one that I absolutely recommend. It circulates around a main character who used to be in a metal band, if I remember correctly, and now that he is retired, he collects a lot of morbid memorabilia and is sent stuff like that by his fans. So his house is just like decorated with morbid memorabilia. And one day online he comes across this item which is supposedly a ghost. Someone wants to sell him a ghost. And he's like, heck yeah, go ahead, get that, I want it. And this package arrives, and it is a heart-shaped box with a suit in it that supposedly has the ghost attached. Well, turns out that's true, and it should tell you a lot that that is not the spoiler. This book goes into so much, and is such a dark book. I'm gonna go ahead and tell you that there are several trigger warnings that I would want to be aware of before reading this book. Definitely look it up on Goodreads if you can before diving in, because it's a lot of troubling stuff going on, especially near the ending. But yeah, definitely worth a read. Super, it's bone-chilling. Like, I don't use that phrase very often, but there were some components of this book which were genuinely bone-chilling, and I thought the entire thing was just, it was fascinating and so well written, and the main character, he starts out as genuinely unlikable, actually hateable, and ends up having this character arc that makes you come around and seeing why he is like that as a person and like what made him that way, and kind of seeing him grow as a person, which is great. But yeah, definitely recommend, definitely, absolutely one of my favorite reads of 2019. Again, if I was going to have this ranked, this would probably be in the top 5. The next book that I want to discuss is The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon by Stephen King. Yes, another Stephen King book. I'm so sorry that I'm so predictable, but I know what I like. Anyway, it's about a family who ends up going hiking in the woods, and their 9-year-old daughter Trisha ends up getting lost. And she has to figure out how to survive and how to make her way back to society, and kind of uses her radio, her pocket radio, as motivation, listening to the baseball games where Tom Gordon is playing, and she sort of ends up hallucinating to an extent, using him as motivation to keep going. She imagines him giving her pep talks and that sort of thing. And there's also slightly mystical elements, the fact that she is a 9-year-old stuck in the woods is creepy enough, and then there are things added in, like she's convinced that there is a creature stalking her, and there's also a theory going around among the people who don't know where she is, that she was snatched by a serial killer and a serial rapist, which is, frightening in itself, because once you find that out, you're like, oh, this thing that's following her, it must be the serial killer. Haha! Anyway, I'm giving away too much of this book. Oops. Anyway, definitely recommend it. It's a short little book, and it's super interesting from beginning to end, especially if you kind of like survivalist things. It's got some survivalism and creepiness thrown in with a little bit of sports fanaticism, which I generally would not be into. But hey, Stephen King, right? The 16th book I want to discuss is Gulp by Mary Roach, who is one of my absolute favorite authors. She takes random topics like this and just makes them so interesting. This topic in particular is basically the digestive system and the mouth in general, discussing food, discussing taste, and everything relating to the digestive system and the olfactory system. Not that that's the system in itself. Anyway, it was an immensely interesting read and addresses questions like, why do we enjoy crunchy food? How much is too much to eat? Like, how much food can you eat before your stomach bursts? And can constipation kill you? And it addresses all of these interesting but gross questions in a professional way. Absolutely recommend it. I think it is the only nonfiction book on my my top 19 books of 2019 list, which I need to work on next year. But yeah, definitely recommend it. Definitely recommend Mary Roach in general. My favorite book by her is probably Stiff, which talks about cadavers, basically, and the science of cadavers. The 17th book I want to discuss is another that is the only one of its kind on this list. It is Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur, and it is a book of poems with illustrations to go with it. Most of them have to do with heartbreak and how this individual handles heartbreak and being a woman in general, basically, and handling her sexuality. Very short read. I read it, all of it, sitting at the beach one day, just for a couple of hours, and it's so moving and visceral and real, and I genuinely loved every minute of it. It is potentially very triggering. I would look up any and all triggers that you can beforehand. But it's also absolutely worth looking into. It is one of those books that can kind of change who you are as a person to an extent. It's very powerful. And absolutely one of my top reads for the year. It would be in my top 10 easily. if not my top 5. The 18th book that I want to discuss is The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, and this is just one of my favorite books in general now. It's kind of a middle grade book, honestly, but anyone can read it. It's falling out of its dust cover. Oops. It is about, in the beginning, a family is killed by a serial killer, basically, all but a little boy who ends up escaping and kind of toddling down to a graveyard. And the ghosts in the graveyard end up protecting him and making sure that no one harms him. And he ends up growing up there with his only real parental figures being ghosts. He goes to school there, and that's where he lives his life. Until one day the serial killer ends up coming back looking for him. It's such a sweet, borderline wholesome read to some extent, but also rather spooky in some way. And it's a quick read. It doesn't look that short, but it's a really quick read. It has illustrations, and it immediately became one of my favorite books in existence. And if I can, I'm going to convince my 12-year-old stepdaughter to read it. Maybe she actually will one day. I don't know. I just know that I freaking loved it. Absolutely every single bit of it. The 19th and last book that I want to discuss, I saved for last for a reason, because this was my favorite book of the year, and it was also the first one that I read this year. It is Nosferatu by Joe Hill, and there's just so much that I would love to discuss about it, but there's so many spoilers. But basically, this individual is kidnapping children and taking them to this world that he deems as Christmas World. I feel like that's the best place to leave it. The main character in the book is a little girl. She basically has a tricycle that lets her teleport to an extent, and she ends up finding out that there are other people who sort of have powers like that in her world. Like, there is someone who's able to sort of read the future through Scrabble tiles, and it's just I know those two things don't sound like they go together. Like, this one guy is kidnapping children and taking them to Christmas World, and then, basically superpowers. I don't know. But it does. It goes together. And I love it, and I'm sort of tempted to reread it for Christmas because it is such a Christmassy book. It's a creepy, Christmassy book. And it's delightful. Well, I'm not going to say it's delightful because it's so dark, but for me, it is delightful. I adore it. It is one of my absolute favorite books in existence at this point. I'm not just saying that. It's right up there with The Color Purple and Harry Potter and, books like that. Books that, I would never replace in a million years. This is among them. It is my absolute favorite book that I read this year. 100% recommend it, especially if you like spooky things or Christmassy things or just generally creepy things. If you love Stephen King's writing, definitely look into it. I don't know what else to say here. Absolutely look into it. Number 1 of 2019.